Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the first Making Public History seminar for 2024. I'm Margaret Anderson from the old Treasury building, and I'm your host for this evening. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I thank them for their care of country and of culture, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd like to extend that respect to any other elders from anywhere else in Australia who may be present tonight. The Making Public Histories is a seminar series offered jointly by the Monash University History Program, the History Council of Victoria, and the Old Treasury Building. Each event aims to explore issues and approaches in making public histories. The seminars are open to anyone who's interested in the creation and impact of history in contemporary society. And I'm delighted that so many of you have joined us this evening. This particular seminar is also offered as a contribution to the Women's History Month program in Victoria. Now, just a very brief introduction to the format for the evening, although I'm sure you're all well used to webinars by now. But this is a webinar, so unlike a Zoom meeting, only the presenters and the hosts will be seen and heard. Each speaker will speak for between 12 and 15 minutes, after which there will be a 5-minute question and answer for each individual speaker. And there will also be about 20 minutes Q&A at the end with the full panel. If you have questions for the presenters, and we do hope that you will, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. But if you have any technical issues, please use the chat button and we'll do our best to help you. Of course, please keep your questions polite and respectful. Now, if for any reason a presenter's internet connection is slow or disrupted, they may turn off their videos and continue with voice only. And finally, as you heard at the beginning, we are recording this webinar tonight. The recording will be available in a few days' time. Now, we have a terrific opening seminar this evening, which is also highly topical. Almost every day at the moment, we read something about Australia's housing crisis, whether it is the cost of homes for first home buyers, the mortgage squeeze facing families, or a critical shortage of rental properties. It seems that the cost of housing is forever in the news. So we asked 3 prominent scholars to reflect on that crisis and on the history of housing pressures in Australia. And we have 3 wonderful speakers with us tonight. Our first speaker is Professor Janet McCalman, AC, of Melbourne University. Janet will be well known to many of you from her 4 award-winning books of social history, the most recent of which was Vandemonians, published in 2021. She also co-authored the book What Happens Next? Reconstructing Australia After COVID-19 in 2020. And Janet's presentation tonight is entitled Landlords and Landless. Welcome, Janet.
And hello, everyone. Here we are after all those things. Greetings, and I want to talk to you about some sort of mega trends, because what happens in Australia's housing is not entirely restricted by our national borders. So here are some history lessons for present-day campaigners, most of whom seem to not know anything about what's gone on. As we all know, the history of a settler colony like Australia is that we are created from stolen land. It's part of what the historian John C. Weaver called in a book, that's a very bad picture of the cover, the Great Land Rush and the building of private wealth. And so Australia was largely peopled until recent times, with the exception of the gold rush period in Victoria, by assisted immigrants or convicts or people who arrive largely without capital. That almost the entire population of Queensland were assisted immigrants, which I think has affected their politics and culture ever since. It was subsequently populated by strategic land grants, free or subsidised, to develop the productive economy and embed settlements. The deal was, come here, work hard, and you too, for the first time in your family's deep history, for most of them, own a piece of the earth. This will give you solid security and a base for your descendants to build their independence. And we expect you to be eternally grateful in the ballot box. But it's really that we have to recognise that it's been the government that dispenses the earth on this land, of course, which is actually still owned by King Charles. From the beginning, the instrument of transferring Indigenous land to others has been the state, through land grants, miners' rights, including towns' rights, selection acts, closer settlement, war service homes. All wars since World War I have had them, soldier settlement blocks, both wars, and then there was the sum clearance and public housing since the late 1930s. From 1956, Commonwealth state housing agreements prepared funds to the states, which Bob Menzies decided should go to cooperatives and be mostly focused on building houses with state funding for private sale. We're now seeing an expansion of social housing, not only from government efforts, but from NGOs. And here's a particular typical war service home. So Australians have particularly been put on the wealth ladder by the state since 1945, and in the period 1945-1970. Between that time, just that 45 to 1970, 36%, sorry, of all new homes and flats were directly financed by government. By 1970, around 20% of all houses and flats in the country had had large government subsidies. Thus, Australians and new Australians were subsidised to get a home, which they could then rely on inflation to increase their family wealth. Now, of course, property provides security, but it only builds wealth by virtue of inflation. This is not just about residential property. Commercial property is very expensive by international standards, and its high cost flows through every business transaction. Every cup of coffee you buy includes the cost of the property on which that work has been done. So perhaps it's not really rising wages that drive inflation. They're only struggling to keep up. Rising interest rates and property values do. And that's the big driver of wealth creation in the country, is that we get rich without working. James Bellick's wonderful work, Replenishing the Earth, looked at settler colonies, or the Anglophone settler colonies, and he identified the inevitable cycle of booms and busts in those colonies, which have prospered from resource extraction and then peopled with subsidised settlers. This involves mass transfers of people, technology and capital. But we could argue that Australia is still in the colonial mode, because we stand 91st out of 133 on the Harvard Lab Index of Economic Complexity. We have a less complex economy, for instance, than Moldova, many African countries, and certainly all of Asia and all of the OECD. And we still behave like a settler colony, making money out of mining and agriculture, and as far as the people are concerned, by private real estate. We're perhaps not a banana republic, we're a rentier's republic. And if we look at the case of Victoria, which is obviously what I know best, the land boom of the 1880s, which really shaped Victoria right up until the Second World War, was turbocharged by gold. And the wealth of gold that was brought into Australia and globally was astonishing, and an astonishing money bonanza, unfortunately too little of which was to stay in Australia and then be invested in the wider economy. It was going to be invested in housing. The crash after the boom in the 1890s lasted, in fact, for half a century, with Australia only registering sustained economic growth from 1938. One of the good effects, of course, was that it preserved most of our historic buildings. We didn't have a slash and burn clearing out like Toronto or Chicago. Building societies had enabled people to get on the housing ladder before the crash, but housing in any places subject to flooding was very cheap and could be bought up by relatively poor people. So the Collingwood Flat, South Richmond, the boggy bits of South Yarra and Paran and Windsor, and so on. Many houses were built in the 1870s up to the crash by tradesmen who might build in their own time, sometimes pinching things from what sites they were working on, and they built a couple of cottages to see them through old age. Where we live in North Melbourne, we've got 4 houses next door built by Mr. Carrick, who started off as a storeman, and by the time he retired, he could call himself a gentleman, which of course was the ambition of most lower class immigrants to Australia, and certainly of convicts. Many ex-convicts who did prosper were delighted to be able to call themselves a gentleman in the rate book. The housing development in 1939 in Melbourne was patchy. There were lots of gaps left by the big crash of the 90s. 19th century houses were dotted all over Essendon with gaps in between. There's a bit of infilling going on in the Edwardian era. There's a bit more infilling in the 1920s. But the war service homes made a major contribution. And so there's significant areas of suburban Melbourne which are war service. And those homes were secure. Having followed the families, some of them in the charitable organisation records, they might be in severe straits in 1931, but they die in that house. They were not foreclosed on because they were ex-servicemen. One of the many advantages that the Anzacs had once they got back to Australia. So, and inherited houses were also there and were used to protect unmarried daughters and widows whose actual cash incomes were very low, and they had to live off the rent of that property which their father had bought. Indeed, in fact, when I was at school, I think that a good half of the unmarried teachers who taught us were living in houses bought by their fathers. And that was the only way they could house themselves in the 1960s. So most landlords, if listed in the 1937 report into slum reclamation, were single owners of properties, and they were women or they were deceased estates. Only 2 were egregious slum landlords, and both of those were highly eccentric social isolates. The worst of them, himself living in squalor in North Melbourne, and neither was fit mentally or to be able to maintain their properties. So what was the post-war housing crisis? And if you're my age, you probably grew up on your parents reminiscing about how terrible it was in 1947 as they were expecting you. There'd been very little housing built during the 1930s and Depression and World War II for obvious reasons. And in the inner suburbs were ones where renters with landlords who did not earn enough from their rent to maintain houses and were now degrading into slums on a very large scale. Rent controls during the war and later similarly led to neglect, while tenant protection frustrated many newly married baby boom parents from getting into a home they'd bought. There was a shortage of building materials, a shortage of labour. Sounds very similar to today. But one advantage, the thing that changed it and was very different from today, was there was still a lot of affordable land. In the middle ring suburbs, in the market gardens and the orchards in the outer east, old racecourses like Ascot Vale and forced slum clearance for large swathes of Collingwood, North Melbourne, South Yarra, South Melbourne, was made available land for both public and private housing. But the land was there. It wasn't that far from the CBD. It was, of course, completely unserviced. And here we've got in Sunshine, some of the typical people remaking Australia after the war, displaced persons, from their names, sounding they're post-war immigrants from the DP camps. They're in Sunshine. They've got mud up to their knees and they haven't got running water, but they're all ever so cheerful for the photographer. This is 1953. And many of us grew up on the stories of people wading through mud up their knees to get to the bus, if there was a bus. So the housing crisis after World War II, in fact, took 30 years to fix. 30 years by which time people either got on the housing ladder or the state had caught up in providing public housing. But there were a lot of bad choices made. You know, this is, if there's anyone who lives in South Carlton, this is to scare the willies out of you. The states controlled the purse strings of home building, with state banks providing the financial support for individuals. In the Housing Commission of Victoria, it was dominated by a group of engineers who were enraptured by visions actually of socialist modernity. A couple of them were very left-wing and went to the Soviet Union for inspiration. But there was also a strong puritanical social reform, social rebuilding imperative that you've got to clear out the rubbish housing, and with that the rubbish people, and replace them with high-rise engineering solutions. This was their plan for Carlton, and as you will see, the whole of South Carlton, all the heritage area, is to be levelled and replaced with high-rise and the walk-up flats. And so it was to be filled with tower blocks, and that was modernity. Now, thankfully, the Residents' Action changed that course of history. But the other thing was that what they were wanting to do was they believed that antisocial behaviour and problem families were caused by bad housing, not that there was a more complex relationship between delinquent behaviour, principally in alcoholism and petty crime and poverty and housing. So therefore, what they wanted to do was what they did was build housing for the deserving poor. I'll get to both. So here's the dreaded plan. And in fact, they were going to clear all of Carlton right up to Princes Street. So that's nearly all of North Carlton. And here's the cemetery. And this was the section that was going to go. So they would have erased this whole suburb. And this was still going on by the end of the 1960s, when the real battle for the inner cities, which is beautifully told in Trendyville, where it's a combination of action between residents, the churches, particularly Methodists, led by people like Brian Howe, and local government. But the book that blew it all apart was this one by Mark Jones, and he was actually a friend of the people I was share housing with in Drummond Street in 1970, and this was the time where he was telling us what had happened. It was a PhD from the ANU, and he was a diffident sort of chap and seemed a little bit simple when you met him. And so the Housing Commissioner said, "Oh yes, Mike, come in, you can have a look at anything you like." So he did. And what he found was that the cost of building the tower blocks, such as you saw in those plans, was far higher than building what people actually wanted. They wanted a freestanding house with a garden in Reservoir or Glenroy, and that would only cost $10,000, whereas to build a high-rise tower apartment was going to cost $19,000 per apartment. So the towers were, after an uproar, abandoned after they'd built 47 of them. They are now ready for demolition and renewal. There are people going around saying their heritage value needs to be protected. If you have to live in one, you don't feel very kindly about the heritage value during a heat wave, because they are death traps. The Housing Commission of Victoria went on to build an enormous part of the suburban infrastructure of the city. Most of Reservoir, Preston, Broadmeadows, Glenroy, all those suburbs in that particular corridor. Then, of course, Heidelberg West, which started with the Olympic Village and is now part of Housing Victoria's big renewal program, which I can tell you about. Hampton East was another area. Alamein and Ashburton were complete, almost suburbs built by the public purse. And all around Victoria in regional towns, suburbs like Wendouree in Ballarat, large parts of Bendigo, Shepparton. It was the first time that Aboriginal people began to get decent housing was through housing being built in Shepparton, and every major town was having public housing. It was an extraordinary effort carried out by that time by a Liberal government under Henry Bolte, and done with industrial efficiency through the factory in Holmes Glen, which was building prefabricated concrete structures. They have certainly appeared to have done a better job than they did in the UK with the tower blocks, which our tower blocks have been structurally much stronger. Only one in Kensington has had to be demolished for structural reasons until the brick one in Nicholson Street, which is just being pulled down now, had to come down because it was falling apart. The walk-up flats, which were done in prefabricated concrete, have degraded very quickly with leaking and damage, and they are now the last ones are being pulled down and replaced. In North Melbourne, all the walk-up flats were completely replaced in the time of the Hawke government, when Brian Howe was Minister for Housing, and Richard Wynne, who's just retired as Minister for Housing in the Victorian government, was his electorate was his officer, and they managed to get all of North Melbourne rebuilt. You wouldn't know today that it was public housing. So it's a very high quality area of townhouses and special flats. So that's what happened. So it's an enormous effort that was done, as I said, with industrial efficiency, reasonable quality. A lot of the original designs were good, but it was still done as cheaply as they could, as it was with the schools, because the government found suddenly it had to build nearly 90 high schools to educate the baby boom. And unlike New South Wales, where they were built nice buildings out of brick, and unlike the lovely brick schools that the first Kane government had built up to 1955, they were built out of concrete bricks, and they have degraded very, very rapidly as well. So what they were doing was building this public housing for the respectable poor, for the deserving poor, for the working poor. And the assumption was that everyone would be in a job, so that the 25% of their wage that would become their rent would in fact bring back a reasonable return to the department, which would pay for maintenance and upgrading. And if you were an alcoholic or you had a criminal record, you did not get public housing. There was considerable discrimination against anyone who might thought to be out of control. So very different from today, because today public housing is open to everyone. Near us, we live near a very large estate in North Melbourne, which contains a unit for people who've just come out of jail. They also have been providing housing for refugees and immigrants in various successions. When we moved here, they were mostly Chinese. Today, they're mostly African. And that's been a very important service that many of the towers and sorts have replaced. But in fact, what's happened is that working tenants have been replaced by people on pensions. Old age pensions, certainly, but very much people on invalid pensions and disability pensions of various kind. And the proportion of people on disability pensions has grown enormously in Australia in the past 50 years. It's been a massive increase, particularly because they're now recognising mental illness to be a disability, and the system is more supportive. But what it means is that the income that's coming into the ministry is very much reduced, and they were unable to keep up maintenance because they just didn't have enough cash flow. The other thing that began to happen was that the people who stayed for a very long time changed in their needs. Most of the housing was built for families. So most of the flats were and houses, standalone houses, had 3 bedrooms. But after 30 years, the children had fled the nest. Often they were left with a widow living in a house with 3 bedrooms, and there were new families who desperately needed a larger place. So there were difficulties in trying to adjust the sort of people who were going to get public housing. The other thing that's happened and has been going on in the tower blocks is the complete rebuilding of them internally, so that they go from 3 bedroom to being 1 bedroom, which means putting in kitchens and bathrooms to every flat, so that's for every bedroom, and that's a very slow process of doing that. And they've been filled with people who are on their own. We know that the greatest need at the moment for social public housing is from single women over 55, and that's going to only increase because the costs of living for elderly, if you haven't got much super, become very, very high. So this is where they've got the problem of adjusting the needs of the people on the waiting list to the housing stock that's actually available. Plus, a lot of it was sold off under Kennett, and it's gone from the public list to being in private hands. And we see a very big change in a suburb like Reservoir in terms of its social profile. And so we've seen that sort of change. But you could see here the people going to have a look at the newly built towers, and someone protesting very strongly at what they see as the regimentation of human life in public housing. So at the much larger picture, and these larger economic forces and political forces have affected our story. We now see 1945 and 1975, particularly through OECD countries, as the great social democratic era, funded by high marginal tax rates, which were leftovers from the Second World War, when the rich really had to start coughing up, or else everything would go up in flames. The reaction by the mid-70s from then on, with inflation, the oil crisis, and the growing resistance of the rich to paying high tax, and led to the emergence of new economic orthodoxy that the market knows best and the state is the enemy of your freedom. And so this is when the great immiseration of the state started. America had a massive debt from the Vietnam War, but Donald Reagan got office on a promise of reducing tax, which he did. And this became the mantra of the West, and it was very difficult even for progressive governments to resist the blandishments of their public servants, who were all believing in this new economic orthodoxy. The deregulation of banking led to the failure of state banks, which tried to compete in this new sort of cowboy land. And the money that started to come out led to a turbocharging of finance and the growing financial industrialization of the economy, where the rich were making their wealth out of finance and trading rather than investing in a manufacturing economy or a society investing in infrastructure. And these tax cuts released private money in the economy, which was in search of investments. And as real wages grew, the only investment option, particularly for ordinary workers, especially people who'd come here as migrants, non-English speaking background, was the property market. The stock market was too tricky and opaque for people to be able to play. And so even with Keating's compulsory superannuation scheme, which is only bearing fruit now with a wealthy retiree class who have cash poor children, property was always the safest hedge against poverty and old age, as it had always been in Australia. The result was that we've now got a relatively cash poor landlord class that cannot draw the old age pension, nor pass their property titles without stamp duty to their children. Currently, much of Bridge Road in Richmond is owned by poor aging migrants. So we've got, as much as the housing campaigners want to picture all the enemy as being rich landlords who are greedy, there's a very large proportion of them, as there were in the 1930s, who are cash poor. And in fact, what we're beginning to see is the housing stock deteriorate in quality, particularly a lot of the stuff that was built rather shoddily once building regulations were released and were weakened under Kennett. So we can see around us in this area a lot of places that are already showing water damage and window damage and so on. Now, this is to give you a picture of what was happening globally. This is the work of Thomas Piketty. And what you can see here is these massively high marginal tax rates. That's Britain, and this is America. So that during the 1950s and the 60s, it's nearly 60%. Sorry, what am I talking about? 90%. So they really began to drag out excess wealth from the grip of the very wealthy into the common purse. And the prosperity of the 50s and 60s is because of the power of this income redistribution through taxation. And then we can see the crash, the fall, and the immense collapse in taxation revenue. And with that, the gradual loss of investment in infrastructure. What we're seeing at the moment, when this has come out in the new Accord report by Jason Clare's Accord for the universities, is that the universities have been left to bear, for instance, all the costs of research and research infrastructure on their own, from their own earned income, whereas in every other country in the OECD, private enterprise, the private sector and government are actually funding research and development properly through taxation and investment. So why do our universities become corporatized and capitalist? That's because they had to. But the rest of the society is not pulling its weight in funding universities and in funding research. That's why we are still 91st on the ladder of economic complexity. If you want to have someone else to follow and look at this man, Gary Stevenson. He's got a very good interview on the thing Novara Media. He's got a new book out, what's his first book, which is now top of the charts in England. He's a working class boy from the East End who was brilliant at maths and became a very successful trader for Citibank and then saw the light. He's a bit of a rough diamond, but he's extremely perceptive about what's happening. And then with the with even the quantitative easing that had to happen, first with the GFC, then with the pandemic, all of that excess money didn't go into investing in society. It went into buying property. And so rich people were starting to buy the houses that people's kids were meant to buy. So where's the money that's going into buying up property and pushing up prices? And every second day on the Age front page is telling you wacko, property prices are rising again. And then the next day it's about property prices being too high. So what are our lessons of history? It is that the supply of land is finite, really, yes. Even in Australia, and we've actually run out of affordable metropolitan land. And that's what's so different about our housing crisis compared to that of the 90s after the war. We cannot afford to build more Craigieburns or Cranbournes. We have to densify. We have to make do with what we've got. Overall, private wealth is locked up in property, and that means it's not available to the general economy, nor easily accessible to members of the fortunate class to spend on alternate housing unless they start borrowing a lot of money. Property owning for rental is increasingly not viable for many landlords who are themselves often paying rising interest rates, having been lured into becoming speculators by things like negative gearing. The only sector who's doing really well are the financiers, and home buyers are working away and getting exhausted and getting depressed, making money for the finance industry via the interest payments. None of this contributes to the wider economy. Indeed, it all depends on continuing inflation. It is keeping, therefore, Australia poor in our infrastructure, in our economic complexity, and in our innovation. But you see, it's a political wicked problem. 2/3 of the electorate own a property either outright or are paying a mortgage. And once you own a property, you need prices to keep rising to avoid negative equity. So sorry, prices cannot fall by 30% as people are calling for. The only way to do that is to have a depression on the scale of that of the 1890s. Those who own outright also need interest rates to rise to boost their superannuation incomes. So that's 2/3 of the electorate. And although the older ones are slowly dying off, this is going to be around for a while yet. So 2/3 of the electorate has a vested interest in high property prices. The landless third that remains, some will have chosen their parents wisely, but even that they will not inherit often until they're in their 60s, and they themselves are leaving the workforce. So we've now got this section of the community which feels entitled to housing. Many of them, they've grown up believing they would own their own home. It's not going to happen. And the other thing is that they're not going to earn enough, because we've got a lot of young people, even university graduates, who now face insecure working lives forever because of the shrinking state. And the other thing that really changed everything in this country was that after the Second World War, the huge expansion of the state really provided the basic structure and foundation for a new middle class and giving people secure jobs. So if you've got increased university education, you've got more educated people who expect a professional life and fewer jobs for them. We've got, therefore, a credentialed precariat of surplus people, and don't start trying to argue that a universal basic income is the solution. It isn't. So what's the biggest lesson of history? Housing, like healthcare and education, in fact, cannot be paid for by most citizens out of their own earned income. We have to amortize these needs, like health and education, and those risks via collective state support in the case of housing as a human right. The forms that state support must take will be varied and often hybrid, as they are in Victoria at the moment, where even though there's a lot of criticism from the Greens, in fact, there's a number of very innovative ways in which government and the private sector are collaborating to expand the quality and the quantity of social and public housing. But we've got to remember that the Australian prosperity was not built by hard work and individualism, but was built by an interventionist state, starting with the convict era, which was often paternalistic. And the Anzacs, in particular, enjoyed significant lifelong state benefits. And so their outcomes in that sense, from my latest work, were considerably improved because they went to the war, not made worse by their war service. So, Australia, clutch your pearls. The future is coming for you. Thank you.
Janet, thank you. That was an extraordinary survey of history here. And there are so many questions there, but I'm a wee bit worried that we may be running a little bit behind time. So with your indulgence, I think we might save the questions from your presentation. If you've got questions, please do start popping them into the Q&A, and I'll be keeping an eye on them all the way along. But in the meantime, if you would just keep them, please. Yes, we do have some here. Keep them, please, and we'll get to them at the end. Now, our next speaker is Professor Kath Hulse. Kath is Professor Emerita of Housing Studies at Swinburne University of Technology. She brings a unique background to her research, having worked also in senior positions in policy and planning policy within government. Her most recent publication is an analysis of the private rental market in Australia, and we've just heard a bit about that from Janet as well. The title of her presentation this evening is How Did We Get Here? The Rental Crisis in Australia. Welcome, Kath.
Thank you. Sorry, everyone, just having a technical issue. Yeah. We've got incompatible systems. No, is my screen?
See your screen, Kath. We
can see the screen, but you can see the notes. Is that right?
Yes. No, we can see your screen fine.
Oh, I can't see it.
Oh,
I can't see it myself, but as long as everybody else can see it, that's fine.
yes.
I'll struggle on. Thank you to Monash University History and the History Council of Victoria and the Old Treasury Building for inviting me to participate in this panel and for that kind introduction. I'd just like to start with an acknowledgement of country. Can you see that? I'm sorry, I just can't see what you're seeing. Ah, it's come on.
If you can move your slide, can you move your slide, Kath?
Yeah. No.
Does Rowan need to take over, perhaps?
Yeah, Rowan, if you could take over. I'm not sure what's happened. It's there, but I'm not sure I'm seeing what you're seeing.
Is that okay, Rowan? Yeah, there we go.
Yep. Excellent. So I'd just like to start by the acknowledgement of country, and this has been mentioned at the beginning, to say that we respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are traditional owners of the land on which Swinburne, with whom I work, Australian campuses are located in Melbourne's east and outer east, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'll leave you to read the rest. I think I'm with Janet. I mean, as a starting point in talking about the ownership, occupation, and use of land and housing goes back to the issues that are raised in the acknowledgement, and you cannot ignore them. However, in terms of today, I'm going to be focusing on mainly the last 30 years, and we've had a great introduction to a sort of macro view of trends over quite a long period. But I'm going to focus mainly on the private rental sector, which is the sharp and pointy end of the current housing crisis. If you can't find somewhere to rent, you haven't got housing. If you can find somewhere to buy, good for you. But it is the sharp and pointy end of the housing crisis. So many historical accounts focus on colonial settlement and land and property ownership. So in the 20th century, a lot of this discussion was about the history of home ownership in the post-war period. And you can see from the very simple graph that's in front of you, takes us from 1945 into the 1970s, which coincidentally is the period that one of Janet's periods. I'm interested in the orange line, which is the renters, which at the first post-war census, about 43% of all households were private renters. And that had been a very common experience in the first half of the century and before that. You will see that the post-war social settlement part of that was the active promotion of home ownership in some of the ways that Janet has just described. And that took the home ownership rate in Australia up to the low 70s by 1966. And at the same time, the private rental rate went down to the same period. So that's quite a dramatic change in the housing system. So I'm going to have a look at the housing crisis subsequent to that through the lens of the private rental sector. And I'm going to argue that this represents a significant change to the post-war social settlement, which was based on, there have been a number of influential accounts, such as Cassell's characterisation of this period in Australia as a radical wage earning model of welfare, different to the high social expenditure welfare states of Western Europe. And he argued it was a model of social protection for workers, breadwinners, premised on high rates of home ownership. Of course, it's highly gendered in the context of the time. That meant male workers, and women were not included in that. So along with post-war investment in a new model of public rental housing, and these figures relate to Australia, not Victoria, and you will see that despite the enormous effort that state housing commissions put into construction, much of that was sold, so that by the 1971, which is the end date of that data, it's making a fairly modest contribution, but significant contribution to housing Australians as a whole. There's quite a bit of variation between states. I think that the important thing is it appeared at the time as though private renting would be a residual and declining sector, and was much ignored for the last probably 20 years after that date. If we can go on to the next slide. In fact, what happened, and this is taken from a slightly different data source, since the mid-1990s, there have been significant changes in housing tenure in Australia. And you will see that the blue line at the top refers to those people who own property without a mortgage. And at the start of that period, just after the recession of the early 90s, some 43% of households owned their home without a mortgage. So they were in a situation of having very modest costs for their housing, mainly council rates and maintenance, a great deal of security, and were the beneficiaries as house prices started to inflate during the 1990s. The orange line refers to, and you will see that that tailed off and has tailed off to the present. So there are far fewer people now in that happy situation of owning without a mortgage. What's happened instead is two things. One is that the percentage of households with a mortgage has gone up, and they are exposed to interest rate changes and other aspects of the crisis that are widely discussed in news media. And the one that I'm quite interested in is the yellowish line, which shows the increase in private renting, which started in the 1990s and has continued and is continuing. So it's quite a dramatic reversal of what had happened in those early post-war decades with really a revival of private renting, which is generally not as pure tenure, where rents are set predominantly at a market level. And as we hear daily, those rents are increasing quite substantially. And the disappointing thing, I guess, is at the bottom, which is the public housing, only public housing, which has tapered off in terms of the percentage of households that it accommodates, despite the sort of investment that Janet had talked about in terms of Victoria. So next slide, please. This isn't as comprehensive, but why are we seeing a revival of private rental and that move to mortgaged home ownership? There are many factors, and I've just picked out a few here. One of them, which has been a very significant change, is increased female participation in paid work and the rise of two-income households or 1.5 income households. There's a very direct correlation between increased female participation in work and house price increases. It's been factored in to house prices, and it's unusual now to find amongst younger people households where there isn't at least 1.5 incomes to sustain home ownership. And those that try to do it on one income basically can't do it without a lot of help. The nature of employment has changed over that period. So there's been a rise of contract and casual employment, the gig economy, none of which gives certainty to people about their income and being able to sustain payment of a mortgage or even rent over a long period. There are significant delays in partnering and parenting, and these are obviously interrelated. In the 2000s in particular, there have been changes in the level and composition of migration. Not only have levels of migration increased, but a lot of that migration, which used to be permanent migration, people who came here and intended to stay, there's been a big increase in temporary migration of various types, including international students. And the temporary migration in particular has a very large effect on the private rental market. Of course, that has a dramatic effect near to universities and other types of education institutions. And the way in which governments change visa types and preference to visa types flows through directly into the private rental sector. So business migration, for example, there may be a period in private rental and then often move on into owning. Refugees often moves into rental, and international students, as I've said. We've seen the rise of the investor landlord. More people are doing it. I take Janet's point that there is a cohort of landlords who are cash poor. Some of them are from older migrant groups. There is also evidence of more savvy investment and multiple property ownership by some people, which makes a difference to the sector. We've seen a period of house price inflation greater than wage increases. And there's many effects of that, but one of them is that instead of being a transitional sector, which is what was assumed in the 1970s and 80s, that there's been an increase in renting over the longer term. It's not a transitional stage between leaving home and buying a home. It's long-term renting. And that was first identified as early as the 1990s by Marianne Wolfe and Chris Meyer of Monash. So we've known that for quite a long time. But what we mean by long-term has been increasing over the years. So there are some of my broader changes, which I think are significant in the private rental sector. Next slide, please. So these are pretty hot off the press, and you may or may not be into figures, but what I'm showing here is that not only has there been an increase in private rental investment, I call it, for want of a better word, and the number of private renters, but there's been a structural change in private rental supply. And we've been monitoring this since 1996 and through to the last census, based on census data. It's interesting because it includes all rents, not just the sort of asking rents that you hear about in the paper, which are typically higher, but these are all rents that people are paying. And the thing to note with this, if you look at the left-hand side, you'll see that back in the 1990s and 2001, rents were very much clustered at the low rent end. It was an affordable sector to people on lower and modest incomes. You will see that something quite dramatic happened between 2006 and 2011, and then subsequently, so that rents, and I should tell you that these are in real terms, so you're comparing apples with apples, that rents now clustering at a much higher level in real terms. So the nature of the private rental sector and what it offers has changed considerably over that 25-year period. Next slide, please. And the other thing that's changed, which is also quite interesting and is reflected in other Anglo countries as well, is that while there is still a very significant and consistent number of lower income households in the private rental sector, there's been an increase in private renters on moderate and even higher incomes. And you will see that's very marked if you follow the data from left to right. So in the highest income group and the next highest have been big increases. So what does that mean? So that means that there's a lot of competition in the private renting, and the people who were on sort of incomes that were renting in the mid-1990s are well and truly outbid by those on higher incomes. There are a lot of reasons for that. So some of them are deterred home buyers. Some of them not in a position to buy at the moment. But it's become tougher and tougher for those people who are on the lowest incomes. Next slide, please. So it's perhaps surprising in view of that some of the institutional settings around the private rental sector, which has undergone this quite massive market change, that the institutional settings and the policies haven't changed much at all. So we've had, one of the biggest factors was deregulation of housing finance in the 1980s. Some of you may be old enough to remember that you used to pay an interest rate penalty if you were not a homeowner. You had to pay more for your loan if you're an investor. And that went with deregulation. There was a lot more money available to invest in private property, and taxation concessions favourable to private landlords, of which negative gearing is the one that's most commonly discussed, but also concessional rate on capital gains tax, on nominal capital gains. So the system supports and continues to support. It's not targeted. It's not designed to bring lower rent property onto the market. It's worth more. The taxation concessions are worth more the higher the income that you're on. The second sort of issue is around what's the best way of addressing housing-related poverty. And so the demand, what I call demand subsidies, which is government money to help renters, which was enhanced during the 1980s as part of an anti-poverty reduction regime, has somehow become the main means, certainly financially and numerically, of helping private renters who are struggling, rather than supply measures. So at the same time as those demand subsidies have increased, supply measures, there's been lack of investment in public and social housing, some substitution of some not-for-profit rental housing for public housing. And the third area, which is very significant, is state-based regulation of residential tenancies, which in the mid-1970s was described by a report for the Commission of Inquiry into Poverty as being a scandal and based on landlord-tenant law as applied to agricultural society in the UK, and some of the strongest words that you'll ever read in a report. Since then, there have been a series of waves of reform of residential tenancies to improve the balance between private tenants and landlords, although coming off a very low base. And that continues, but it's very slow, always hotly contested. And there is a way to go. Next slide, please. So what I call the boiling frog means that we've known for quite a long time that some of these things are happening. We've been able to chart structural change in private renting as well as growth. We know that there's been increased supply of private rental, but it hasn't increased the supply, which is affordable for those on lower income. It just hasn't increased it, even though there's a significant number of lower income households. We do know that demand subsidies are not a substitute for investment in affordable rental supply if you're trying to solve the problem. We know that the market is delivering supply at mid-market levels, and the main target of that is deterred or deferred home buyers who are able to afford it, but who don't want to pay too much because they're saving for a deposit for a house. We know that the investment landlord activity that can outbid home buyers, and it's generally in the established home market, not for new homes, and contributes to house price increase. And I think my main argument is, despite all of that, there's been policy and inertia despite significant market change. And we know that, for example, negative gearing has become a dirty word in some circles, and people won't touch it. So the misplaced optimism is the idea that the private market would provide lower cost, lower rent housing for people if they had their rent assistance or demand subsidy money. In fact, it hasn't. The opposite has happened, but the policy settings haven't changed to reflect that. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of broader issues, and I don't want to run into some of the things that Janet was talking about. We've tracked a growth in midlife and older renters, and in that group, women are overrepresented. And we know that older women are the biggest increasing group of homeless people. So this is a very significant issue. Older renters used to be well catered for by public housing, but now there are more living in the private rental sector. There's mounting evidence of the health and social impacts of renting, and that's about affordability, but it's also about insecurity, which relates to some of the legislation and other factors, and also about quality and condition, which was the concern about private rental in the 1930s. So there's mounting evidence that there are quite dire effects of that. And some of my colleagues at the University of Adelaide have done some excellent work looking at the link between housing, renting, mental health and health. I agree with Janet. What I'm presenting is part of the broader financialisation of housing. It's about increase in asset prices, reliance on asset welfare, which does take us into Thomas Piketty and others who've commented on that. There is a body of work which suggests that people's position and life chances are determined by their particular what sort of chair they sit on in the housing system. So Lisa Adkins and colleagues who wrote this lovely book on the asset economy and in other works argue quite persuasively that where you are in the housing system is the primary determinant of your life chances, not income, not education, not occupation. It's about assets and asset ownership. And finally, we know that there are generational issues as well, sometimes overlaid by this family status in the housing system, and that those inequalities in wealth are going to be transmitted through inheritance and a pinch of luck. So if you're one of 6 children, not so much. If you're an only child, it works for you. But in that process, the people who don't have assets, that is people who are renting, particularly private renters, miss out. They don't have those sort of assets, and we've tracked that for renters and homeowners at every age cohort. And at every age cohort, renters have far less wealth than do owners, not only property wealth, but also superannuation and financial assets and other things. So in that particular game, the renters lose out. And next slide, please. And that's it. So I'm sorry to end on a fairly dismal note, but you know, it's indicative of, it's looking at it through the lens of private renting, but it indicates why we have a housing crisis and what that crisis looks like and who it's affecting. Thank you.
Kath, thank you very much. That was extraordinary, most interesting, and some very interesting parallels with some of the things that Janet was saying too. Depressing though they may be. I'm going to keep us moving because the time is passing. Our final speaker this evening is Professor Anne O'Brien. And just before I introduce, though, I've been asked by Molly, who does our tweets and social media, if people would please tweet using the hashtag making public history with capitals for each of the words. So there we are. If you could do that, she would be very grateful. So our final speaker this evening is Professor Anne O'Brien. Anne is Professor Emerita of History at the University of New South Wales. She has written extensively on the history of poverty, welfare, gender, and Indigenous rights in Australia, and she recently published a paper on homelessness as a feminist issue. She's currently working on a history of homelessness from the late 19th century until the present. Long overdue, I would say, Anne. Welcome, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to say tonight.
Thank you, Margaret. And it's lovely to be here. And thank you to Janet and Kath for such interesting presentations. I would like to begin by paying my respects to the Bedjigal people on whose land I'm speaking, and to acknowledge the highly paradoxical position that I feel I'm in as a non-Indigenous person talking about housing and homelessness on country that's never been ceded. I thought it would be useful tonight to historicise the current housing crisis by actually addressing the questions, the really interesting questions that Margaret raised in the advertising for this webinar, which focus on the role of home ownership, rising rents, and age and gender in this crisis. And I do think there's a strong case that the crisis has actually been precipitated by the declining opportunities for home ownership among the young middle class that don't have access to family funding. A product of the financialisation of housing, as Kath has just told us, put in train by the Howard government. This crisis, I think, is exacerbating existing inequalities and has exposed mortgage holders to what the journalist Alan Kohler calls a policy of cruelty, that is, using housing to control the economy. Well, I think given the demographics of home ownership and its importance in Australian social memory, which Janet has traced so profoundly, it's not surprising, I think, that it's taken challenges to it to precipitate a crisis. The key question for me is whether that crisis will obscure or sufficiently draw to public attention the deep structural injustices that have long faced tenants and people experiencing homelessness, and whether in fact it might lead to substantive, holistic change that would actually benefit the whole society. So what I want to do tonight is actually provide a historical perspective to inform the case for such change. I am unapologetically writing and presenting a political history. I'm focused, but a highly rigorous history, of course, I'm sure you'll agree, and one that you will, I hope, find conducive. What I want to do is focus on previous crises in housing and homelessness to make the overarching point that a housing problem has more or less continually beleaguered modern urban Australia, and that the only thing that will solve that crisis and the ongoing problem is large-scale public housing. Again, I think very much in agreement with Janet. Well, the housing crisis of the 1940s is reasonably well known because it led to the biggest public housing build we've ever had. But there was a lesser known crisis in the 1910s that also led to limited but important builds. It was worsened by demolitions for city improvement in all the capitals at this time. You'd probably accept the North, I beg your pardon, Janet, the Queenslanders were different. But housing stock has never kept pace, even before that, with urban population growth following the long boom. So acute was this crisis that in Sydney, the Labor government established a tent city, which it called Calico Town, just down the road from me here, in Maroubra. In Adelaide, families were living in cattle stalls. In Melbourne, groups of workers camped on suburban beaches. Tenants were galvanised into action through spontaneous local protest and organisation. Well, as probably a number of you know, the builds of this moment were constrained by an environmental determinism that privileged space, fresh air, and the suburban house and garden, and also by a political dedication to the so-called free flow of capital. Together, these meant that those who most needed a roof over their heads were bypassed. And let's note that this is actually a renting crisis. It's not the ownership crisis that I think we've got now, though I do accept, and of course, Kath, you're totally right. I'll say more about this at the end, that there is also a renting crisis. Maybe one of the things we can talk about in the discussion is which has had the greatest airing. The important point I want to make about the 1910s, though, is that really influential contemporary players could see the core problem even as they chose not to solve it. It was the illustrious architect John Sulman who declared in 1914 that, and I quote, "The unsolved problem in Australia is ensuring housing at an economic rent that living wage workers can pay," which was striking recognition that wages were insufficient to pay the rent required by investors who constructed housing. Well, as we know, by the 1940s, the crisis the federal government faced then meant that it was much more willing to act on this knowledge. The need to win over the people to the war effort, offset the attractiveness of communism. These things gave rise to a public housing project that was driven, at least in part, by that powerful idea of housing as a right. And these are this is one of my favourite quotations ever. No state government has ever made a serious attempt to assist people on low incomes to obtain homes. The housing of the people of the Commonwealth, each according to his social and economic life, is a national need and accordingly should cease to be a field of investment yielding high profits. Well, as we know, this project faced significant pragmatic and ideological obstacles, but it addressed Sulman's unsolved problem to a far greater extent than any other policy before or since. But there were limits to the Commission's vision. Single people were not eligible for public housing in its original conception. The subjects of the crisis were homeless working class families, as they'd been in the 1910s crisis. So it's no coincidence then that it's also in the Reconstructionist 40s that the first social surveys in Australia of the homeless as a social category were carried out. These surveys found their subjects not just to be single, but to be psychologically and morally deficient, eligible at best for shelters, at worst for involuntary detention. And they found them to be largely male. Here, let's look at the gender factor because this is really important. As is well established, single women were, of course, also homeless, but they had trouble being seen. And that's partly because they didn't want to be seen. They practiced what Sophie Watson called strategies of concealment, a fabulous phrase. But the other thing, of course, is there were fewer public refuges for them. And so they actually weren't within the researchers of this period's immediate gaze. Notably, their lack of visibility, I think, stands in very stark contrast to the hypervisibility of mothers of young families who were threatened with homelessness. But these, of course, are flip sides of the same powerful assumption that a woman's place is in the home. Now, the point about this assumption, well, there are lots of points about this assumption. One is that, of course, I think it made and continues to make it very difficult for, in all sorts of subterranean ways, for women to leave abusive relationships. But the other thing it does, I think, is reinforce the idea that the homeless woman is exceptional or unnatural, and it opens up the way for her to be objectified, I think, in all sorts of ways. And the irony here, the paradox here, is that the structural factors that actually, beleaguer women's lives, unequal wages, continuing unpaid labour, violence within the home, all these make the homeless woman, very normal for women to be homeless. It's a weird sort of way that we present what should be absolutely, rational and reasonable to understand. Well, one of the problematic aspects of the growth of this sector, I think, the homelessness sector here. Sorry, I forgot a really very important point. I was going to say this gender issue continues to matter because when the government first started to fund shelters and refuges in the 1970s and 80s, and when homelessness came to be a sector, the system had already developed around the needs of rough sleeping men, so it further marginalised women experiencing homelessness. Okay, so one of the problematic aspects of the growth of the homelessness sector, I think, was that it occurred alongside the increasing neglect and underfunding of public housing. The precise relationship between these two intersecting trends, I think, needs further research, but there's no doubt that the drying up of public housing exacerbated homelessness. Over the decades from the 1980s, scholars and service providers repeatedly decry the lack of exit points for people using services. Well, the dangers and suffering caused by homelessness were brought graphically to public notice in the late 1980s with the inquiry into homeless children sponsored by the Australian Human Rights Commission and chaired by Brian Burdekin, and it especially touched a nerve because it was accompanied by a high-profile documentary screened on ABC TV called Nobody's Children. And I think this is a really important moment because it generated a crisis that hasn't gone away. It's been a long crisis, another paradox. It hasn't always registered at the same pitch, but it's been institutionalised and normalised, I think, at the same time as being mourned and abhorred. But it's been allowed to go on for so long because I think it's been seen as detached from the experience of the majority. And funnily enough, looping back, most governments have preferred to fund short-term accommodation rather than permanent, safe, secure housing. Well, one of the outcomes, I think, of the current crisis is that it's forged a connection in public understanding between housing and homelessness that was hardly there before. When I started reading about homelessness in about 2016, it was largely seen as a discrete problem of a discrete group, as this isolated figure on the front cover of one of the monthlies of that year suggests. Now the media, more often, I think, refers to tenants being forced into homelessness, pushed into homelessness, implying that it could more or less happen to anyone. Well, this is hardly a good thing in itself, but it's narrowed the conceptual space between the homeless and the rest, and I think offers discursive support for the ongoing efforts to implement the policies loosely known as Housing First. Indeed, the social and intellectual shifts of the last 40 years have, I think, at least to some extent, mainstreamed the idea that mental illness, intergenerational trauma and disability shouldn't disqualify people from housing, but give them priority. Not to mention that significant amount of research that shows that housing is more cost-effective than hospitals and jails. Further, while the current crisis has been stimulated by threats to middle-class home ownership, it's also given the treacherous conditions of under-regulated renting, I think, a new space in the media, and arguably, hopefully, renewed renters as a political force. Well, just to go back to John Sulman, his view that the problem of ensuring housing at an economic rent was insoluble was disproved, I think, by the public housing project of the 1940s and 50s. And the research and activism of the last 40 years has driven home the ethical imperative, as well as the social benefit of housing the homeless. Whether any government has the necessary political courage to put this into practice is uncertain, but it's certainly, I think, supported by a longer and wider history than's commonly referenced in this space, at least publicly. So thank you. I shall stop sharing my screen.
And thank you. That
My
was a
pleasure.
wonderful introduction, and I'm sure all of us look forward to seeing your study in print when it comes out. When will it be published, do you think?
As soon as possible.
Very good answer.
I'm glad you read my. I've done a lot of work. I'm getting there. Thank you, Margaret.
Oh, that sounds terrific. Now, I probably have been a very bad chair because we don't have a lot of time for questions, but we do have some. So if you have questions, and I can't see any at the moment, but I encourage you to pop them into the Q&A, and we will certainly be keeping an eye on them. And I'll do my very best to work through them if you have them. But I wondered if I could invite both Kath and Janet now to unmute and start their videos again. There we go. That's great. And I just wondered if would it be a good idea if I asked each of you, perhaps, because there are so many similarities between the points that you were making, I thought, both the sad thing is that both over the longer term and in the short term, which is a great indictment. But if there were two things that you could ask of government with some chance of success in this space, what might they be?
You
I
have to
don't-
make it some chance of success.
Yes. What might they be, do you think?
Well, I talk about this a lot at home with my husband, who understands economics, and you might have picked it up, but I don't. But I mean, I think that there are ways. I mean, negative gearing, obviously, the 2019 election has terrified Labor. But if you could just restrict that so that you have, just one property, or maybe trusts, maybe things that seem to be really excessive, that aren't actually interfering with the livelihoods of Janet's, elderly pensioners and so on, but that actually do try and focus the very rich, I mean, I think it's remarkable that the Teals have told us that the people in Kooyong, the people in, the North Shore of Sydney will vote for people who have got principles. And I don't think we should forget that. And I think, you make a case and you make it strongly and you expect to take people with you, I don't think we should let people who have poor politics or, self-interest at stake, set the agenda.
Indeed. Great. Kath or Janet?
Sorry, Kath, go ahead.
Thank you. I agree with that. There has to be a way of bringing into the market rental properties that people can afford on those lower incomes, because very often those lower incomes don't change. Their disability support pensions, their age pensions, what have you, or even very low wages. And that has to be done in such a way that they don't float up to the market again. They have to be kept with rents at a manageable level. Now that, could be some sort of public housing, or it could be more investment in types of non-profit housing, which there's been a, increase in recent years, but nowhere near big enough to meet the demand and the sort of shortages that we've documented over the last 25 years, which are just growing. The problem is getting worse. The other thing I'd do is to make some of the federal funding contingent on the states, doing some more work on their regulation on residential tenancies legislation. And I think that's important as well. I mean, it's kicked along very slowly, but it's very modest. I mean, some of the things around minimum standards for renters that are so minimum that you can't believe that anybody would actually rent a place without those. So I think you can make funding contingent on some of that change, make the states play ball.
Yes. Janet, do you have a quick
Yes,
response?
I do. I mean, this is very partisan, but the first thing would be to shut up Chandler Mather, because it's causing a lot of unnecessary trouble. And in fact, the Victorian government, despite considerable delays, they lost a whole term through resistance by the Greens in the upper house, and resistance which was whipped up by the Greens in local residents association in trying to stop mixed developments. They were arguing we can't have mixed social mixing because that's patronizing to poor people, and if you've got social mixed community, they feel looked down on in the lift, or that there's been a most appalling behavior going on politically, which has caused in the inner city in particular very real problems. Now we're just finally seeing a very old housing estate of walk-ups in North Melbourne, just about completed as one of the new public-private partnerships. They've even built a new school on that block of land. There's about a tripling of actual dwellings. Some are going to be for private purchase. Some are replacing the existing public housing, which was unlivable because mostly all the tenants were disabled. They had to go up 3 flights of stairs. They had no air conditioning or proper affordable heating, laundries that were in the wrong place. That's all been replaced with modern apartments and affordable housing. So the other thing which has happened is that when they've been able to get away with social mixing and using private developers, that's reduced the cost of the houses in that collection of places which are on the private market because of the stigma of the neighbours. But the young people who buy them say, oh, it's terrific, you know, they're actually very nice people. So the headwinds are, in fact, resistance. And whatever the Teals say about their lovely voters, they will not vote enthusiastically against their own financial interests. And so it's going to be the hardest thing is to switch. What we need to have is a significant number of people who own property to vote in the interests of those who don't. And so it's a big bit of the centre. There's lots of people like us who are sympathetic and would do things for our own kids. And I've sacrificed all my superannuation to build a family compound for my 2 children and their families. And you know, I've transferred my accumulated wealth to them. And we need to be able to make it possible for people to do more things like that. We need more multi-occupation. We need more multi-generational households. We need much more flexibility. Now, all the sorts of things which are happening in Victoria, which do get extraordinarily little publicity because that's not in our newspapers' interests to say anything nice about the state government, is that there's an extra range of things happening. Just round the corner from me, there are 76 social housing units built by Homes Victoria, which are done with an NGO. They have a top-class architect. The local residents complained that a house of social housing should not have brick facing because that was for posh housing and they don't deserve to have something that looks glamorous. It's that bad that you're dealing with selfishness and people scared about their own property values, and they don't want their kids to go to school with children who live in public housing, so that the schools in the inner city that are by estates are underpopulated while the other schools are overpopulated. So we're up against class, we're up against fear, we're up against greed. So first of all, to shut the Greens up. So Max Chandler
I'm so sorry, but I might actually have to stop you there, which is a real shame, but we're almost out of time.
Sorry, okay. There's one other thing which has happened is that Victoria needed a much bigger share of GST because they have committed to so much. The building of schools, the building of public housing and social housing and infrastructure. This is the biggest spending government we've ever had, and building with great imagination and courage. But we took big hits both in the GST and in the pandemic. So thankfully we're getting more out of the GST. But of course, New South Wales and Queensland are complaining.
I don't think we better start that one. We have a lovely question, which it would be very nice for you all to be able to respond to, but alas, we are out of time. And that's from an anonymous person who just says, for all of you, do you think there is a genuine opportunity to move from housing as an asset to housing as a human right, or is that an unrealistic dream? So perhaps we can all just say yes or no.
It's worth fighting for. It's worth fighting for.
You've got to fight for it.
It is.
And also, Janet, on your last, you went in your PowerPoint to the lady with pearls from the thing. So you believe that too.
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, I believe that this is a big political fight.
Oh, I know.
And our political parties are very weak. We've got to have
Yeah,
great
it's pathetic.
inspired. Yeah,
I
no,
agree. I agree.
yeah,
Sorry.
no. So, you know, we don't sit here and wait other people to do it.
No, absolutely.
Because it
Good
won't
point.
happen.
Well, thank you so much, all of you. And I'm just so sorry that we have to stop this conversation. And I apologise to the people who've put some very nice questions into the
Yeah.
Q&A. If any of you will I think we can make a copy of these so we could send them to our speakers. And if any are addressed directly, then you might be able to respond to them perhaps afterwards. But can I now just say a very special thanks to our three wonderful speakers this evening, to Janet McCalman, Kath Hulse, and Anne O'Brien. It was such a fascinating discussion from you all. And you covered such an enormous amount of ground. It was just marvelous. And thanks too to our colleagues behind the scenes, Rowan Howard of Monash University, who managed the webinar seamlessly, and Stephanie Holt and Molly McHugh of the History Council of Victoria. And Molly was busy tweeting all the way through that. I'm afraid I wasn't able to follow them all, Molly, but there we go. Now let's see if this PowerPoint of mine will work just one more time, and we'll get these last slides up. There we go. No, we're not. Never mind. Let me just not fiddle with it. A special thanks also to our Monash University publishing sponsor, because Monash provides us with all of the speakers with a special gift, and they've all been approached and asked if they'd like to nominate a publication from that list, which is terrific. So a special thanks to Monash University Publishing. And a brief plug for our next seminar, which of course I now can't read, Rowan, so you might have to help me. It'll be held at the same time on Thursday, the 30th of May, and it is on the topic. If you can turn on your mic, Rowan, and just tell us what it is, that would be terrific.
Thanks, Margie. It is energy transitions and historicising Australia's nuclear energy debate.
So there you go, from housing to nuclear energy. Never let it be said that on Making Public History, we aren't prepared to deal with controversial subjects. So I do hope you can join us for that. Finally, thank you, all of you, so much for your attendance this evening and your participation through the questions. The recording of tonight's event will be available, hopefully in a few days' time, but certainly next week sometime, on the History Council's YouTube site. So thank you very much, everyone, and good night.